Mick Schumacher came into Formula One in a pretty awful position. One, he came into probably one of the worst cars we've seen in the past 10 years. Two, he had a teammate which was pretty awful and had his own issues in Mazepin. And three, he came into a team that really had no upside in Haas. That's not to even mention the pressure that was on him with the name of Schumacher on his shoulders and, his birthright to be able to go onto the F1 grid. Having your dad, Michael, be a 7-time world champion must be hard enough in a normal day and age, but to also want to follow in his footsteps, I can't even imagine what that pressure must be like. Ever since he was a kid, really, there's been scrutiny on Mick, especially once he got into karting and wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps and show what he could do behind the wheel of a race car. But the question has to be asked, and does still remain about Mick Schumacher. Does he have a chance of getting back in F1, or does he even deserve getting a chance of getting back into F1? And to answer that question, I think we need to look at a few different avenues, and the first thing we're going to do is look back at his time in Haas. The first year or so was a bit of a write-off for Mick. 2021 was a bit of a rough period, not only for Mick himself, but also for Haas in general. Haas came into that season telling everybody, basically, 2021's a write-off, we're not going to do anything with the car, and we're focusing all the eggs in our basket into 2022, and we're going to try and make that car as strong as possible with the new regulations coming in. Now, despite 2021 being a write-off, he did do relatively well in that position. He did beat his teammate Mazepin, which is always the first objective of any F1 driver. He stayed mostly out of trouble. He did make some daft mistakes, like, of course, the first race of the season. He spun out in Bahrain early on, but he did manage to finish the race. And he did manage to get up to, I think, 12th in Baku was his best result. So, there were some positives in there, despite it being a pretty miserable season overall for Haas and the team. But obviously, if you take into consideration how bad his car was, how bad the team was at that point, and how bad the situation was with his teammate, it was a pretty awful year for anyone to have to deal with in F1, never mind a rookie driver like Mick was. And then you go into 2022, and this seemed like the moment really for Mick to step up, go into a car that was obviously maybe more on par with the rest of the grid, and try and take it on and take that challenge head on and trying to score some consistent points, or maybe be in the fight for points on a consistent basis. But again, Haas and the circus that seems to be around them quite a lot, and the attention they tend to get for the right and wrong reasons, maybe hurt him more than maybe most people realised. And there was also the return of K-Mag. But despite all that, and despite all the issues that Haas had, I don't really think in 2022 Mick helped himself too much either. You look at the amount of mistakes he had in practices, in qualifying, and during some of the races as well, and he really did cost Haas a lot of money in terms of repairs, new components, and, just general damage in terms of their fights for points and championships and things like that. I mean, obviously they weren't going to be championship contenders or anything, but they were looking to make a big push up the grid and be sort of in and around that 10th position more consistently. And with the amount that he cost the team, they couldn't really justify keeping him on, and that's why they eventually brought in Hulkenberg to replace him for the 2023 season. Now, to be fair to Mick, he did have two good races, or consistent races, in the season in Britain and Austria, where he finished in 8th and 6th respectively. And again, I think in the Haas car that wasn't really performing all that well, that's a pretty good position to get into, especially when it's only your second season. But for me, it's your first proper season really with the type of car that he had under his belt. But that was the exception rather than the rule, those points finishes. He didn't get any more points finishes there. He had a couple of retirements and a couple of weekends to forget overall in that 2022 season. And another argument I would always look at is when you actually look at the profile of his career from Formula 4 onwards, and pretty much even in his karting days, he had a bit of a iffy first season with a team, and then the second season he would jump up. And to be fair, in F1, I think he did that. He did make a bit of a jump in the second season. Maybe not as much as people would have hoped, especially Haas. They would have maybe wanted him to push into 20-plus points range when he only finished with 12. But again, there was still those bits of improvements that we did see throughout his career, and he did take another step forward. Though again, I don't think we should really be looking at 2021 in terms of Mick's overall results. So it gets to the end of 2022. Haas have let him go. And then he's also got the double whammy of Ferrari letting him go after their sort of 4-year association with him as being part of their driver academy. But for Mick, and probably for some fans of his, or a lot of fans of his anyway, he does have a bit of a saviour in Toto Wolff and Mercedes. They took him on in 2023 and made him their reserve driver. And to be fair, it's probably not a bad place to stay, because Toto's managed other drivers in similar situations. He got Ocon a drive back at Alpine after a year or so out when he was originally at Renault and then went into, well, it wasn't Force India, it was Racing Point at the time, and obviously got him his position there. So a big help could be made from Toto Wolff in getting him back on the grid. And in 2024, he is returning to racing, just not on an F1 grid. He'll be racing with Alpine in the Endurance Championships. But the problem for me, and another issue I have in terms of Mick getting back on the grid, is there's just no space. And let's look at the grid in itself, because if you look at Mercedes, they're tied up till 2025. Ferrari are re-signing the two drivers again, allegedly. That's the rumours anyway. Red Bull is a whole other conversation to have, and probably could be a discussion for another video at some point in the future in terms of their situation with Verstappen and whoever they decide their second driver to be. You've then got McLaren, who are pretty settled with Piastri and Norris, and if Norris does stay on well into the future, then McLaren's probably going to be set into 2026 and onwards. Haas, would they want him back? Probably not. Would he want to go back? Probably not, because by all reports, him and Gunford didn't have a good relationship by the end of his time there. AlphaTauri, or Racing Bulls, or whatever you want to call them, by the time of the start of the 2024 season, have a pipeline of Red Bull Academy drivers ready to go and ready to fill in that spot. And plus, Sonoda's probably there for the foreseeable future if he doesn't get a move elsewhere. Aston Martin, they've got Drugovich in the waiting line, I suppose you want to call it, if they want to take up Drugovich as an option. They've also obviously got Stroll taking up the seats for as long as he wants that seat. Alonso's there for the foreseeable, as long as he keeps driving as he is. And to be fair, with Aston's massive resources, they're going to be able to get any driver they want within reason. I think maybe probably the Ferrari drivers and the Red Bull drivers and the Mercedes drivers might be out of reach unless they run out of contract. But apart from that, anyone else on the grid will probably try to get to Aston at some point. And then you've got Alpine, who, again, we've mentioned before, they may be an option for Mick because of the fact that he's racing for them in the race or World Endurance Championships. But again, are Gasly and Ocon going to move on anytime soon? I think personally Ocon might move on potentially to Mercedes because of his link with Wolff, if, say, Hamilton does retire at the end of 2025. But again, that's another season down the line and kicking the can down the road further for Mick to have to deal with. So for me, the only two realistic options at the moment on the table at the end of 2024 are Sauber and Williams. Now, with Sauber, it's an interesting one because obviously they've got their change to Audi in 2026, or whatever the name changes that they're revealing on Sunday this week will be. Basically, they've got Bottas in for the foreseeable, probably for the next year. I think that he's got one more year on his contract. Zhou's got another year on his contract. But I also think that Porsche is probably coming into a seat at the end of that season, depending on what happens with Bottas and Zhou. So it'll be interesting to see if Audi do take over the reins a little bit earlier, if they maybe nudge people in that direction, say, look, we want a German driver in our car, let's get Schumacher. He has one of the biggest names in motorsporting history, and we can develop him a little bit more in our system and try and get him on the right foot again with a good car. Then you've got Williams, who are, again, in another bit of a predicament because they've got Albon, who is there till the end of next season. And again, depending on what happens with Albon, he may stay at Williams and be their first driver, or he might move to a bigger team and ascend up the grid like his performances have probably been warranting over the past season or so. And then when you actually look at Logan Sargent, he, surprisingly to me, he got a contract extension into next year. Maybe it was due to a lack of options, or maybe it was just to a lack of drivers that wanted to go to Williams. I'm not 100% sure. But they are giving Sargent a fair crack of the whip and giving him a second season, so we'll have to see how he performs. But I actually think if you look into Mick's results in a proper car in 2022 and compare them to Sargent's, I think Mick has more of a case than Sargent does to have an F1 seat at this current moment in time. Not saying he's going to be in the higher up of the grid, but he certainly has an argument to be in the lower half of it, in my opinion. But again, we have to be realistic. If Sargent's bringing in a certain amount of money into Williams, and there's more money going into Sauber with Audi coming in and things like that, it's hard to see where these teams are going to wedge Mick in unless Formula One does an absolute meltdown of a decision and makes it 3 drivers per team. Then I think Mick gets in there quite comfortably. But unfortunately, at the moment, whilst there are 10 teams and only 20 seats available, I think the game of musical chairs isn't going to be in Mick's favour for the long time. But again, like I mentioned before, he does have one big fighter in his corner in Toto Wolff. And if Toto can get him a seat, you know damn well sure he's going to be able to get him one. He did it with Ocon, who, for me, I think before he had the chance to really show it at Alpine, didn't really have the pedigree to get back into F1, but with the management of Toto and with his ability to be able to negotiate and be able to get people back in, I think he was able to do it pretty well. So hopefully for Mick's sake, Toto's able to do that. But of course, that's all my thought processes on it and how I see things. You guys might see things completely different to me. Let me know in the comments what you think. Of course, do you think Mick even deserves another chance? Do you think he'll even get on the grid at any point in the future in F1? Let me know in the comments. And as always, this has been Taking the Pits, and I'm Grimmy. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you on the next video.